I'm Neil Midgley. As you can probably hear, I have not only just thumped my microphone, but slightly lost my voice. So I'm sucking a thing at the same time as trying to chair a session. My father used to tell a joke about somebody in court accused of a sexual offence, and the judge said, and he couldn't speak, and the judge said to him, "Have you tried sucking a fisherman's friend?" And he said, "Don't you think I'm in enough trouble?" So that's kind of how I'm feeling today, although I haven't quite yet been accused of a sexual offence. This is the first 10 minutes, how to turn your new drama series into an instant hit. And I'm delighted to be joined on stage by the teams behind two of the biggest current hits in British series drama, the Scott and Bailey team and the Call the Midwife team. So from my left, the audience is right, we have Sally Wainwright, one of the leading TV drama writers in the country and the principal writer, in fact the only writer I think on...
No, not quite.
Principal writer on Scott and Bailey. Saran Jones, of course, stars as Rachel Bailey in Scott and Bailey. Nicola Schindler from Red, who is the executive producer of Scott and Bailey and one of the country's leading drama producers. Heidi Thomas, who is the other of the country's leading drama writers and writes Call the Midwife, and Pippa Harris, the other of the country's leading drama producers, who produces Call the Midwife. And to add to our mix, we have James Murphy from the ad agency Adam and Eve. This is really bad, isn't it? The ad agency Adam and Eve, and they make the John Lewis ads, which are little TV dramas. So we're going to kick off, to give my voice a rest for a moment, with a little clip of the very beginning of Scott and Bailey. So, just to stress, those are the very opening, the very first scenes of Scott and Bailey. So, Nicola, talk us through how you came up with that precise opening for the show.
Well, I didn't, Sally did. But, so actually, you should probably answer it. Why?
Well, interestingly, they weren't the first 10 minutes. The very first script of Scott and Bailey was written about a year before it got greenlit. And it was a very different form. It was Scott and Bailey were in CID, not MIT. That's CID is criminal investigations. MIT is to do with homicide, well, murder. And in the original script, that was the only scene that actually came through from the original script that ended up on screen.
Which one of those two? The
scene with Saran and Nick Savage.
Right. So the dumping scene.
Rupert, yeah. And in fact, that scene was 3/4 of the way through the script, and it was the only storyline that survived from that original script. So originally it wasn't intended as an opening scene, but it was. I mean, obviously, I thought it was good enough to be an opening scene. So it had rather an odd genesis, in fact.
Because obviously the opening scene with Rachel and Nick in the restaurant and her being dumped is not a conventional opening for a cop show, is it, Nicola?
No, and I think that's what makes it. But weirdly, we panicked about it not being a conventional opening. When we saw the edit, we went through a really peculiar process of the opposite of what you normally go through, which is you see things in story order and you try and shake them up and you try and get that. The thing you always do in the first 10 minutes is to try and get to the story faster. Because when you work on a script, you think you've got to set up this, set up that, set up. And when you actually watch it in an edit, you realise you don't have to set up, you just have to get on with it.
Yeah.
But with this, we watched it and it was in exactly the order that it's in now. And we completely panicked and we did the opposite. And we tried everything. We moved the scene where she's opening the Coke bottle came first. And the restaurant scene and the scene that follows where she chases him home came in the middle as a flashback. And we tried to do it linear so that we start in the restaurant, we go to the scene that is the flashback, which is her chasing him home, and then we go into the interview room. And we tried everything in order to say, because we were so worried about not setting out our stall up front. And it's when we went back to Sally and Victoria and Laura at ITV, they'd sort of said what sold them on it in the first place is you start with a scene that's nothing to do with the police. Right. And actually that boldness is what made it work. So you start in a scene that you wouldn't expect in a police series where it's all about a relationship, and then you cut to a horrific murder, and that's what sets it apart. And
right.
So actually what Sally had written was exactly right. It just took us 2 weeks to get there.
And Saran, you obviously came up with the idea or jointly came up with the idea for Scott and Bailey in the first place. So can you talk us a bit through that and how the idea came around, and when you saw the finished product, was it like what you'd initially imagined or not?
Me and Sally Lindsay were kind of sat in a pub talking about female protagonists, you know, being a lot of the time wives, mistresses, daughters, girlfriends. And we came up with an idea which we'd sent to Tony Woods at the time, and he didn't do anything with it. I'm sure he's kicking himself now. And then we took it to Nicola, and then Sally saw the idea and wrote a script, which, like Sally said, then nothing happened with it. I think that Sally then met Di Taylor, please, if I'm getting any of this wrong, and then things changed, and
Who's Di Taylor?
Di was my police advisor. I met her purely coincidentally, and she was an ex-detective inspector with Greater Manchester Police, and so she informed how the script went from being about CID to being about MIT.
Right.
And so I think that then and then Leslie came on board. Then obviously Sally was writing for Leslie specifically, and I think what I always loved about Sally's writing, having done Dead Clever and Unforgiven, is the human aspect that we've just seen there, which rather than brilliant dramas like The Killing the Bridge, State of Play, ones that I can remember, where you have someone driving away or someone running away, and you know that that's the killer, but we can't see them. Then you cut to the kind of protagonist getting onto the tube or arriving into work, so you know there's a killer and the protagonist, and they're going to meet, which is kind of formulaic, which we haven't done, is that you get instantly, from an actor's point of view, you're right into the character, and so Sally does a lot of work for you. And I think just after that, so you'd got Rachel's kind of history, then you had Andy looking at Janet's legs, so you knew that was going on during a scene, and then Jill tells Kevin that he's a pain in the arse because he's playing with a coin, and then Leslie introduces us as Scott and Bailey, so it's very quick that you kind of go, oh my God, I've got so much stuff in that period of time, and then you jump to the crime. So I think I'm very proud to have, you know, been there at the beginning with the concept of, really, Rachel Bailey is the only thing that has survived for me, because obviously then Sally changed it to MIT, and then she was writing for Leslie. But
the characters were the same.
The characters.
Main characters.
Yeah, sure. But I can be protective of Rachel Bailey, because, you know, I do feel like she's kind of a part of me when I was 26 or something like that.
And Nicola, you've created a lot of hit shows. Is the conceit of this session correct? Do you have to get it all right in the first 10 minutes?
Well, we were saying, wouldn't it be great if you sat there and went, this is how you make a hit drama? Because we all know that so well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
but
think
you do it more than anybody else in the country.
But those things, you don't sit there and, I mean, you want everything to be a success, but you don't know how, there's no formula. I think things have changed considerably from even 5 or 6 years ago, where you could be slower at the opening of dramas. You could take it more easily because there was less choice and there was less channels, and all those things have made an impact. And now you do have to prove yourself very fast, and you do have to kind of let people understand what they're watching. But, you know, we Unforgiven together, where the first... you were there, weren't you? Yeah, sorry.
Saran had a minor role in that, I think.
A different haircut, it's all right. It was me.
But we did that. I mean, you don't really understand any of it for the first 15 minutes, do you? Because it's different stories. And Sally had said that from the beginning. It's really important that you've got these different stories that they will impact. And that still had an audience that stayed with it. So I think you can have very, very different openings. And so long as they're compelling and, like, engaging, then it works.
Scott and Bailey, obviously, is a big hit. What can you distill now? What is it about it that makes it a hit?
No, and I don't think I ever should, really, because what we should be doing is trying to make it better and better and working on the next scripts and then trying to get the story and then seeing where the characters really go. If you ever sit back and read the reviews and say, they like that, they don't like that, let's do this, I think you're going from the wrong angle.
Let's bring in the other panellists. We're going to have a look at the very opening of Call the Midwife, which is obviously very different in a couple of moments. But Pippa and Heidi, Do you like Scott and Bailey? Do you watch it?
Yes, absolutely.
Should we just arm wrestle and get it over?
No, we do. I mean, I just love seeing television shows that become popular, whether they become instantly popular or build over a few weeks perhaps, which I think is optimal when people start to form an emotional connection with the material. So I'm just always really thrilled to see that television is still coming forward with programmes that people invest in and quickly begin to see as part of their lives. And it takes me back to sort of my youth in the 70s when there were programmes that had the whole country talking. And there's a tendency to think that doesn't happen anymore and dramas aren't central to our lives and don't become common points of reference. But something like Scott and Bailey does, or, Call the Midwife does, or whatever. Yeah. And that's just a brilliant feeling because it makes me feel as though I'm engaged in an industry which is engaged with its recipients.
Pippa, when you watch Scott and Bailey, is there anything about it that you think, oh, that's good, that's a great idea?
Well, it's an obvious thing to say, but it was fantastic to see two such strong women characters in the leads. And as Nicola said, to go, or maybe Saran said, to go into a cop drama through the characters and not through, oh, there's a cut-up dead woman on the floor, let's work out which mad bloke killed her. Because I think the more you can intrigue your audience at the start, the better. And was it Ted Charles, that scion of TV, who said you needed a fight or a fuck in the first 10 minutes?
Which was very briefly the title of this session on the website.
And it got removed quickly.
Till I vetoed it.
Which of course is complete nonsense, and you might need one of those two things.
We've got to fight.
But you might need one of those two things in certain shows. But I think the key thing for any show is to lay out your world and to pull the audience in, and you might do that through a dead body, but I think it's more powerful to do it gradually through character. But taking on board what you said, Nicola, is that there probably isn't as much time as there used to be to do that. You've got to certainly hook people in the first 10 minutes, some way or other.
Well, why don't we have a look how you did it in Call the Midwife? And thus does Pam Ferris stamp her authority.
On the entire show, yeah.
Exactly. So that's obviously a very different opening, and not just because it's a period piece, but that there is much more, it's much more cinematographical, maybe. There's big shots over the, yes, easy for me to say. Cinematic, thank you. Easy for me to say. The big shots down the dock and all that sort of stuff. Was that a conscious choice, Pippa, to set the world in the big sort of sweeping way?
Definitely. I mean, I think we didn't have very much money, to be absolutely honest, and I was determined that we would at least show that we could do scale. And also to just show the world that Jenny was entering into. I think you can immediately get the fact that she's a middle-class girl and she's walking through a world where, probably nobody like has ever walked before. And that contrast is very strong and I think very intriguing. But you don't want at the end of episode 1 to say, well, we had got some really fantastic shots of the dogs, but obviously we didn't have a chance to chuck them into episode 1.
Yeah.
You want to be able to start off on your best foot in production terms.
Why is it important to signify scale in a drama like Call the Midwife, which is a domestic precinct drama?
I think one of the reasons for that is there's a tendency to diss domestic precinct dramas and to assume that anything which is female-centric or emotionally driven is somehow insubstantial, which I think is a great shame because we tell stories of big emotion in Call the Midwife and with very high stakes because it's about birth. So I did feel that we needed within certainly the first episode or the first half of that episode to let people know that this was a drama that was going to have an element of muscularity, that we were going to be a bit bold. But we had to do it in a way that I'm sure most people know that the series is based on a series of memoirs by a writer called Jennifer Worth. And because the books were memoirs, they were very piecemeal. When I first read them, as Pippa, who introduced me to the book, said, she said, you won't be able to put these down. And I couldn't. But in story times, it was a bit like going through Grandma's button box. You'd kind of rummage through and you would find these wonderful gems, perhaps half a page that would give you almost an episode, or there might be 3 chapters that give you a few scenes or a nice B story. So from the word go, Pippa and I were engaged in restructuring the story material so that we could spool it out evenly across the series. But we did actually take material from quite far. I mean, the big A story for episode 1 is about a premature birth, and that comes 3/4 of the way through the first book. And the actual fight, and I didn't know about Ted Childs' rule, even though I think my first TV job was exec by Ted Childs. There was very much this sense that we needed to get something that was muscular and gripping, because we didn't want the drama to be dismissed as lightweight or insubstantial or meaningless. And I was actually, after I'd written the first draft of the first episode, Jennifer Worth showed me the typescript of her second volume of stories, which at that point was only just going to press. And the fight was in there, and I just thought, brilliant, I can use this. But also, the characters that you see having the fight aren't nameless, abstract characters. One of them gives us our B story for the episode, so she's introduced in something which makes a stylistic statement, but also goes on to pay story dividends.
And so just, again, thinking about those brief scenes that we saw there, how much of that, Heidi, do you actually write
Oh, all
in
of it.
detail, every single detail of it?
Well, yes, obviously we have a brilliant director in Philippa Lowthorpe, and she will add certain details. But, you know, I do tend to plot out the visuals quite strongly. Some directors really go with that and embrace it, and others would rather do their own thing. But, of course, what you also have to take into account with all of this is that your script's first airing is on somebody's desk as a read. You know, the first audience is really, in the case of Call the Midwife, it was Ben Stevenson. What's he going to make of the first 10 minutes or the first 10 pages? And I do feel it's incumbent as me on the writer, at least in the very early drafts, to put as much detail in as possible so that I can best represent the drama that in the end we would hope to see on screen.
And the precinct aspect of it, obviously there's that there where Pam Ferris says, which one of you ladies is my patient? But that first case for Jenny doesn't come until about 11 minutes in, I think, Conchita.
Well, actually, the first case in the series itself is the very first birth, is the opening chapter of the book. And it's an interesting thing because it's not just what do you want to have in the first 10 minutes, it's what do you not want to have in the first 10 minutes. And if we'd put that birth up front, you would have had an enema in minute 7, which I thought was a dangerous game to play, really. So we deliberately moved that back, but we did want to include it because it's a generic moment. It's a typical birth of the 1950s that introduces you to the social world, to the strictures, to the way in which things were done, and also to the Pam Ferris character, Sister Evangelina, and Jenny Lee, who is our heroine and our guide. So we needed to see those characters in a typical situation before we went atypical with our very complex, high-octane premature delivery and hemorrhage, which is in the final act, really.
I mean, you and I have talked before, Heidi, about the critical reaction to Call the Midwife, and particularly previews, I think, where I think maybe you were a bit frustrated that people didn't seem to have watched the whole episode before
I was very frustrated. If you send people a first episode on DVD and they're going to review it, I think they should watch it all. And it was just a very gradual realisation. There were clutches of reviews that said, oh, it's so whimsical and so lightweight. And I'm like, excuse me, we've got gonorrhea, well, actually syphilis, because we upgraded the venereal disease along the way. You know, we've got a woman who gives birth to a baby.
Was that Ben Stevenson? Was that his no?
I wasn't there.
Not enough
No,
jeopardy.
it was just we decided we would be bold, and at that point we didn't know we were going to go out at 8 o'clock. So we did think we could accomplish a little bit more medically. But so we've got syphilis, we've got a baby that you see dead in a kidney bowl, and then it comes back to life, and a terrible hemorrhage, and people are saying, oh, it's so whimsical and twee, and that's because it was on at 8 o'clock, and that's what they expected to have from that drama. And I have to say, if they only watched the first 10 minutes, fight or no fight, I think that's what they were taking away, because there was cake and a nun.
Yes, well, indeed.
You know, I just think it's very lazy. People should watch the whole thing and review the whole thing if they're going to do it at all.
Well, people should be paid more to write previews, but that's my stuff. So there is a great deal of, you know, you just talked about it, the syphilis and the dead baby that comes back to life. It's a very graphic first episode, isn't it, for an 8 o'clock Sunday night drama. It's very gritty. I mean, was there any resistance to that from the BBC or?
No, I mean,
from you,
it's really
Pippa?
Pippa's call, this one, but we didn't know it was going out at 8 o'clock until the last minute.
It was commissioned as a 9 o'clock. Well, it was actually very originally commissioned as pre-Watershed, but before Heidi started writing, it swapped to being a post-Watershed show, and then it was about a month before TX when they suddenly said actually it was going to be 8 o'clock. And, you know, both of us kicked off, and obviously they paid a lot of attention to what we said and carried on with what they planned.
We wrote some great emails to no effect.
Yes, snotty emails. But, I mean, I think it's interesting looking at the success of the show and stepping back from it and being slightly cynical. One of the reasons I think the show kind of took off which wasn't a deliberate ploy at all, was that we had held back Miranda Hart to episode 2. So a lot of people maybe tuned in initially thinking, oh, it stars Miranda Hart, where's Miranda Hart? And of course she isn't in the first episode, but then they got drawn in, and then they realised obviously that she's coming in episode 2. And so they stuck with it. So I would tell anyone to put your big star in episode 2. That is clearly the way to go.
Quite a bold decision, isn't it?
Well, it wasn't planned that way. It was done again for character reasons, because we wanted the first episode to introduce Jenny, who's the central character, and not allow her to be sort of crowded out by Miranda's character Chummy, who is slightly larger than life and obviously sort of a bolder creation in some respects. And I think that worked well, so that people were hooked into Jenny and her trajectory before Miranda arrived in episode 2.
And you've also, what's also clear just from the text in those opening sequences is that you've assembled a cast of pretty much the greatest TV actresses.
Apart from Saran.
Well, of course, Scott and Bailey is built around 2, very central performances from 2 of our...
Well, 3 Amelia.
Yeah, exactly.
You decided that you wanted 3 female protagonists, didn't you, rather than 2?
Well, it's a kind of little conceit of the show, really, that it's Scott and Bailey, but actually it's about 3 people.
Yeah, and and great to have. Why not have the boss as another woman? And I think that I was just thinking as we were talking then about how, like, our show to have the personal stuff and then the crime, and then to have Scott and Bailey scenes. It's quite. I'm now kind of going, oh, Sally, you do a really great job. But, thinking about it. Anyway, I don't know why I said that.
Well, but the interposition of the Amelia Bullmore character, the boss, creates triangles, doesn't it? And triangles are the essence of a lot of drama, or often usually love triangles. But she is a character who is able to set off Scott and Bailey against each other, isn't she?
Well, I think I also thought it was an interesting set of relationships. The ages of Janet and Jill are similar, and they are old friends. So they both have very different relationships with Rachel. So right from the beginning, we established that as a nice triangle.
And does the Pam Ferris character play a similar role? Is that a correct analysis as a sort of agent provocateur?
I don't think so, because it's very much about our team. We, the Nonnatus House team, we call them, and the way in which they interface with cases of the week, which is, obviously a fairly classic trope in medical drama. And it's often about the relationship, which I think is what midwifery is all about. I have to say, it dictates a drama which is about the relationship between the caregiver and the patient. And the relationships between the nuns themselves they're delicate, and they tend to be quite positive. I think that was something our actresses enjoyed very much, was the idea that they weren't having to play relationships where they were constantly in competition over a man or carving each other up in some way. And that wasn't something that I set out deliberately to do, but when the actresses commented on how much they'd enjoyed it, it's something we tried to buff up and keep on going, really.
We're going to move on to have a look at some of James's work. James has been sitting there patiently listening to this. When we're going to see the She's Always a Woman. John Lewis had the sort of first one that made the big splash in 2010. When you make ads like the one we're going to see now, do you feel that you're using the same cinematic grammar as our other panellists, or is it a completely different job that you're doing?
I think there's obviously there will be some filmic grammar that's common, but I think there's a very, very different dynamic, because what we're actually doing is, I think we have to be very aware that unlike a TV drama where someone they may have sat down to watch it, they may have made an appointment to watch it, or the way that platforms are developing, they may have actually decided to stream it online at a totally different time. They've decided to watch it, we're interrupting, and we are not invited, so we have to, in a sense, we have to make an impact, never mind 10 minutes, it's probably 4 seconds, 5 seconds, something like that. And we have to put something sufficiently compelling in front of an audience that they don't hit the button and change channel.
Okay, well, let's see how you did it in that first John Lewis ad.
You can get
Rosie, you get a round of applause.
Yeah,
And
Tears, sorry.
And my co-producer, Victoria, and I, when we did the edit of this VT, we were sat in the edit suite, and We were both in floods again. I mean, I must have seen that ad 100 times. Did you set out? I mean, that went out in the first ad break of Britain's Got Talent, and the whole country burst into tears. Did you set out to do that?
No. That's not generally how you sell things, making people cry. And
but it was good crying. It was Olympic crying.
Yeah. No, I think funnily enough, the way it started was very different. The original concept was a boy, and it was a baby boy and a toddler and things like that. And then when we saw it, I think our reaction was kind of twofold in the sense of, first of all, John Lewis, like a lot of retailers of that kind of shape, actually relies on women for about 80% of its revenue. So actually it should be the story of a woman. And the next thing was really to think about how do you shape it, because the way that it was originally written, it had an entirely different ending, and we actually shot an entirely different ending, which was you have the story, the kind of passage of time, and at the end, when in the penultimate scene, when the couple walk behind the hedge and the children kind of cartwheel behind them, and then the camera moves across the hedge and you come out at the other end, and you're still in the garden, and you move across, and the older woman walks to the end of a line, and it's a line of all of the actresses from the whole ad, from the toddler all the way up, and they all bow, like it's the end of a play. And we looked at it, and I personally loved it, and but there was a big argument about it, and there was a sense that that was a bit pretentious, actually. People thought, the idea that you'd presented a little play or something like that. So we went back and we actually went to Ealing Common and shot the final scene in a very different way, which I was worried would be too maudlin and would be, in a sense, a bit grandiose for a shop. The idea of a life passing in front of you. But we saw the edit, and funnily enough, I was oversensitised because we just had our first daughter. And I saw the Avid edit and had the same reaction as you, in the sense you're like, okay, fine, it's going to work. Yeah. And I think, there are other changes. I mean, it had a totally different music track on, which was something by Green Day called The Time of Our Life, which worked quite nicely, and someone else put a Waterfall by the Stone Roses on it, which was brilliant as well. And then someone just wandered in with this slightly naff 70s kind of MOR, kind of American track, and put it on there. And again, you're like, holy God, right, okay, this has now gone up another 20%. And so it worked well. But what was fascinating for me was I think that the thing works a lot better as the journey of a woman than it did in the original concept of a journey of a man. And I don't know whether that's because really it's women that matter in terms of that kind of audience, or whether it's because the passage of life or the passage of time is somehow more poignant when you show a woman. Don't ask me why, but...
We've got, apart from you and me, mate, we've got a panel of composed entirely of women and female-based dramas, which are obviously the hits of the moment. Is that something which right now is in the cultural zeitgeist? Do you think the warm-hearted, home and hearth type dramas? I mean, obviously Scott and Bailey isn't exactly home and hearth, but it's female-centred and it's warm-hearted, I would say. Is that, Nicola, Pippa, is that the zeitgeist?
Do you sit there and go, that's what the country needs?
Yes,
I don't think it works like that, because I know you've had a long process of development as well. We developed it when the country was in a different state. So it was never about that. And also, it's about women because that's who those characters are, as opposed to it's about women because it represents women in this country. Right. And Sally's always said they're great women to write. That doesn't mean that the men aren't really good in it. They're just the secondary characters.
And also, you could easily have done a great session with Sherlock and Downton. You could pick out shows which are not female-centred, which are massive hits. So I'm not sure you can draw anything massive from the fact that these two shows happen to have.
And in fact, interestingly, when we were in production, and so obviously, we were making the show and it had been greenlit, there was concern expressed from various quarters that, well, men won't watch it, so obviously it's going to fail, which I thought was interesting because people definitely weren't thinking that something that might skew female was going to be more successful. They thought it would be less successful. And I think ultimately we do have a very strong female bedrock of support in our audience, but men do watch it as well. And And, you know, that's fine, but it was never a deliberate thing, as you say.
Sally, do you think you could write a male Scott and Bailey? Could it be two blokes? Could it be as multi-layered and emotional with
Of course
two?
it could. I'm sure it could, yeah.
Is that what's coming next, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I like to think you could write a show that's about Mitch and Lee and Pete and Kevin. I'm sure you could write a show about Kevin, who are one of our male characters. But that wasn't the brief. The brief was to write about two women. Sorry, can I just pick on something that's just been said, which I think is really interesting, is music. We're talking about the first 10 minutes. I think music is a massive factor. You know, we're talking about so many factors that create that make somebody want to watch after the first 10 minutes. And there's so much that you put into it. You can write your best scripts, you can have the most brilliant actors, and a show can still flop. And I think you're talking about the whole mood and style of a show that draws people in, and I think music is such a massive factor that we don't pay enough attention to.
And you didn't actually show the beginning of ours, because the beginning of ours is our opening title with what I think is brilliant, perfect title music, a really well shot title sequence, which gives us the cinematic thing.
And shows Manchester.
Yeah, it shows Manchester, shows the world. It's very moving, it's very active, which means we can go into a domestic scene. Same as you, we wouldn't really start on that, as that wouldn't be our opening shot.
Got
ever.
static
credits. And the music of Scott and Bailey is absolutely, it felt like the pulse of it.
But it's really odd that I've never been to a tone meeting where we've had the composer there. It's like something that always seems to be something that we tend to put on at the end or think of very much towards the end of the process, and it really shouldn't be, should it?
No.
But clearly, James, for you talked about the other potential music choices for that ad. It's clearly basically the most fundamental decision, isn't it, for you?
And
I
Billy
think
Joel isn't naff. You're not allowed to say
No. And I think it's become apparent that it is. I mean, we've just finished the new Christmas one, and we're now beating each other up about the music, because there's various different opinions and so on. But I think it's actually more than music. I think it's also about the aesthetic of things, because what's interesting with that opening sequence of Scott and Bailey is, I think, almost what we would call in our trade the sound design of it. So the fact that there is quite a lot of silence and pauses and things like that, which make it very, very, you're sort of hanging a bit on tenterhooks. Yeah. And again, I think with some of the series that I think have gripped me, whether it's kind of Homeland or actually The Killing and so on. I know that's probably a really cliched thing to say, but it's one of the things I love about those programs, and I suppose Mad Men, which I don't watch, but I think I can see part of the appeal is just the aesthetic and the mood and the atmosphere that people find becomes riveting for them.
And really, that's all about character as well, because I think the thing that Sally does brilliantly in that opening scene, or in all her opening scenes, is you get Rachel straight away, and it's almost like it's the way she drinks the wine, and that was written in the stage direction. It's the way she drinks the wine, she pours the wine, he's not drinking. And it's the line, "Are you bored of me?" Which is such a strange line if you sit and think about it. But actually it sums up everything about Rachel, which is she's actually deeply insecure in front of this man who she desperately wants to like her. And it says everything that you need to say, and it came in the first 3 lines.
And Sally doesn't finish all her lines off, so she does keep you hanging. So, you know, there'll be half lines. And then the director will maybe go on a couple of looks, which then say the next couple of beats, which I do think draws you in, because you're like, what's going on?
But when you and I spoke before the session, James, you were talking about that's I think it's basically the second shot of the ad, when she's turned into a toddler, she's on the floor, and she looks straight into the camera, little girl. And that was entirely intentional, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, we knew that we had to, because I don't actually think that idea of a story of that journey through life is particularly original. But I think the texture with which it was told, I think, felt quite authentic for people. But what was really important, the second shot, and we went 25, 26 times to get it right, which is tricky when you're talking about a child that small. And it took a long time.
Crying at one point.
Yeah, and I mean a lot of trouble. And also you have to be very, there's a lot of law about how long you can keep children on set and so on. And we wanted to get some kind of where you suddenly felt that character and you could bond with them. It wasn't just some kind of mannequin for an every woman. And the little girl crawls across the floor and she just turned and looked straight down the camera. You were like, that's it, okay? And and suddenly you kind of bonded with her, and you were ready to go on the rest of the film.
But there's no dialogue in your ads. Is that tempting for you to introduce words?
I think it's really difficult, because I think it's tricky when you're dealing with a client like John Lewis, because John Lewis have traditionally been quite anti-marketing, and they're quite mute as a brand. They don't gush, if I can put it that way. And so the idea of talking and selling at people, I think, wouldn't feel right at all for them, in the way that it might for other retailers. And equally, music is, I mean, the thing about music is a shorthand. You know, it's a bit like adverts. Songs are compressed, and they distill ideas or emotions. And
when you look at these ladies' products compared to yours, do you think, get on with it? We've only got 60 seconds to do what you've just taken an hour over.
Yeah. No, but I think because what's interesting though is there is the difference between some TV dramas, because I find I'm one of those probably annoying viewers who does do that dual screen thing where I'm watching the telly and I'm sort of doing my emails or whatever and the internet at the same time. But I was saying earlier on when we were chatting before, there are some programmes where it is impossible to do that, because either they are so compelling or they are so rich that you have to watch. And because I mean, I get incredibly angry if I'm very, very hooked on something and I miss a detail. Yeah. And luckily, with PVRs and so on, you flick back quickly and watch it again. And I think it's in terms of kind of making programmes and dramas and plotting, it's interesting because I think sometimes the plots and the formats are so expected that you can dual screen, because effectively you only need half your mental bandwidth to be able to absorb everything that's being thrown at you. Whereas certainly with, for example, Homeland, which I think had a brilliant opening 10 minutes, Homeland was one of those things where you just couldn't, because you had to watch every second in case there was a wrinkle or a crease in the plot that you missed. Yeah. And but equally, I think, you know, both of these programmes are so rich as well. There's a lot to take out.
But you're just a proper viewer, because I have to say, you know, we made The Hollow Crown as well, Shakespeare's, this summer, which are quite tricky to follow. And Twitter, people are there the whole way through going, oh, look at Tom Hiddleston there, oh, I love him. And you think, can you get back and concentrate, please? You know.
Yeah, or they tweet their snacks. They're actually on Twitter saying, oh, it's alive, when the baby comes down from the in the petri dish, kidney bowl, and then they say, oh, having a lovely piece of chocolate cheesecake, and it's the same person. And it is interesting, because I think one thing that I've noticed over the past 5 years, certainly since Cranford came out, is audiences talk much more about forming a relationship with the characters, and specifically the sort of the thing that you most want is for them to say, I really care about these characters. And I think that has been one of the things about Call the Midwife that I didn't see coming, is everybody cares about a woman in labour and everybody cares about a newborn baby, and the power of that, although it was very emotionally involving as a drama to write, it really, you know, we were constantly moved to tears just with scripts and then during filming and everything. But I think we underestimated the effect that would have on a mass audience. But there is also this very interesting thing about dual screening, is people will be watching it and tweeting, I don't care about these characters. And you feel like saying you're not giving yourself a chance to care, because you're sort of writing a critique of your own feelings as you go along. So we have to work with that. That's the modern world. But I think it's interesting that people crave more emotional engagement with the characters whose lives they're watching. And at the same time, they're making less of an emotional investment themselves.
Maybe if you made it in Danish and then put subtitles on.
Very difficult.
But what happens to the long-sighted? I mean, I always struggle with subtitles, for example. If you're long-sighted and you're tweeting and trying to read subtitles, it's tough. So.
I'm going to open it up to the floor. I'm sure people have questions, but before we do that, if I'm in this audience today and I want to set out and either write or produce or direct a hit drama series, a returnable series, are there lessons, are there holy grails to do that? Pippa, well, Nicola?
Funnily enough, listening to Liz last night doing the McTaggart, she quoted that Dennis Potter line about the job of drama being to make the heart beat faster. And I think that's absolutely right, but you don't have to do it in the first 10 minutes. You know, I think with the drama that people have made an appointment to view, you've got probably at least the first half of it to pull people in. And by heartbeat faster, they don't have to see a dead body, you know. They can just grow to care about these people and see them in jeopardy or whatever it is. But that's what you've got to do.
Nicholas?
I don't think there's a formula, no, because otherwise you do it every time. And some of the things I've loved most, other people haven't wanted to watch as a big audience. So, but you want people to watch it as a large audience all the time. But I think the minute you start working towards a formula, it's probably what Touch of Cloth does brilliantly, which is show that, you know, you can just take the piss out of formulas.
Yeah.
But no, it's about heart. It's about, for me, it's always about the writer essentially and getting what they want to write down there and making sure that ends up on screen. And that's your best chance.
And if I sat or Sally sat there trying to write a hit, it would just become a very cynical exercise.
Yeah.
You know, you have to write the best, that you have to do your best work every day. And funny enough, now we're working on the second series of Call the Midwife. You know, once the series returns and you get your hit, you have to keep on making it as good as that. And just to sit there thinking, what will bump us up from 8 million to 9 million isn't going to do anybody any favours, because you're not thinking about the work.
So, James, do you ever, sitting with this inspirational panel, do you think, I'm going to expand? I'm going to go from 90 seconds to 48 minutes?
I think there's occasionally, there are sort of flurries into kind of people talking about advertiser-funded programming and so on. And I think, but generally, those are done leaving the program making and scripting to the people who know what they're doing. You know, the way people, in advertising, it's a reductive art. You are there to compress and distill things. And I think what's brilliant about amazing drama is the fact that it can be expansive and it can open up and invite you in. And I think that's one of the things that I find, if I was saying what's compelling, it's actually, of course it's about scripts and the writing, but then it's about the casting and the direction and the sound design and things like that, because essentially some of the things that I think touch people is where they're given the space to get into something and to feel that these people are like them, or they have some element of kind of insight into real humanity. And often that's about great stories, but great stories brilliantly told through direction and things like that.
Okay, there's a good note on which to open things up. We've got some microphones, I hope. So who would like to ask the first question? Gentleman there in the middle. Please tell us who you are, where you're from.
Hello, Tim Willage from Red Bin Media. Question to anybody, really. How important do you think it is for the marketing of a show to establish a story's conceit versus creating intrigue around a new drama which may not tell you anything about the show?
Well, we haven't got our marketing person, which is a shame. Well, I mean, certainly, I don't know what you think about this, Sally, but I like audiences to be surprised, and I think there is a current school of thought that you should give them as much story information as possible before broadcast, because then they're more likely to watch it. But I do think one of the things that keeps me watching, and one of the reasons why, for example, I'm a fan of Mad Men, is it's not necessarily the caring thing that draws you in, but you're constantly startled by characters' responses to situations or their actions. And I do think by putting too much information in the marketing, you take that element of surprise away. I don't think it's done us any harm in Call the Midwife. It just makes me personally uneasy when I see, that we're now asked to submit quite lengthy synopses to the press before the show goes out. And I just think if you take away the surprise, you take away a bit of the present, perhaps.
I think I love Mad Men as well. And I think that my favourite marketing strategy is to see the characters just kind of, which they did with Mad Men and they did with The Hour, to just see the characters and maybe even put the characters' names. Maybe that's because I'm an actress and I'm just like, right, okay, what are they about? What are they dressed like? What do they look like? Who they stood next to? And that, I feel that when I can kind of get a sense of who the characters are, is more intriguing than giving away too much of the story. If in the press you find out a little bit of history about the characters rather than what is going to happen, is my favourite kind of marketing strategy.
Sally, do you have thoughts on that? Obviously, it's your creation. Is it?
I don't have any thoughts about it because we have no control over trailers, I don't think, do we? I saw a fantastic trailer for The Accused the other day, the one that Sean Bean was in. Right. It was brilliant. It really, really made me want to watch it, and it's rare that I see something where I think the trailer really makes me go there.
And what was it about that trailer? Sean Bean dressed as a bird.
It was a twist in the storyline which actually was slightly misleading when I watched it. So
right.
It was a very unexpected encounter between the two men, and it was a slight piece of misinformation, in fact. But it made me go and watch it.
James, you're a marketing man. How should we market TV drama? Give it all away?
No, I mean, I think it is much better to bait the hook. And I mean, we've worked with people at the BBC and other channels before working on programme marketing, and you often have that slightly strange situation where you're briefed by the marketing people and they're trying to distill what the essence of a programme is, and sometimes that just ends up being trite. And I think that there is that sense, if you have amazing characters and hints at a great storyline, that can be all it takes. Having said that, undoubtedly the best first few minutes of a programme for me in the last year or so was Homeland. You know, you've got a blonde woman in a hijab or whatever in a Pakistani prison, talking to a Taliban guy who says there's a US Marine, he's been turned. Yeah. That's it. Okay, and you're in, and series record. So, and I think that was almost like an ad in its own right. You know, that first few minutes.
Yeah. Okay. Next question. You got somebody else? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Alex from Broadcast Magazine. I just wondered if there was any difference in approach depending on the length of the series. So if the opening, you consider it differently if it was going to be a long running, perhaps a 10-part or so, it depends, versus a 3-part run or so, or even a one-off.
I think probably you still got to do the same thing in the first 10 minutes. The way you pace story after that changes depending on how many episodes you've got. If you know you've got more episodes, then you know that things don't have to happen until certain places in the series. But in terms of opening a series, I think it's all about immediate impact. So it doesn't matter really how long the series is.
And is it different between a series and a serial? If you've got Unforgiven, for example, you have to achieve something different in those first 10 minutes?
Yes, it kind of is, because you're telling not necessarily a single story, like Unforgiven told a lot of people's stories, but ultimately it is a single story. So you don't have to establish a precinct, establish the characters, tell everyone what the setup is going to be. You have to intrigue and make them want to know what that story is, which is slightly different.
Yeah, so I remember working with Tony Garnett, who's obviously a real sort of TV veteran, on a series 5 or 6 years ago called Lilies, and he gave me the trope for very self-contained story of the week type of dramas where there may be a serial element, but it's very much played in a minor key. And he said you have to set a hare running at the top of the episode, and by the end of the episode you have to catch the bugger, was what he said. And that's actually, if you're doing something like Call the Midwife, where the stories are relatively self-contained, and that's common, I think, to a lot of crime dramas and medical dramas, that's the rule I would try to follow. But I've also done sort of more serial type stuff, and I agree completely with Nicola that it's more about creating intrigue and a tone, and certainly engaging people's attention, but also not setting them up with the expectation that that story will be completed within the hour. And that's a very delicate thing to do, I think.
But you've got to be really careful that you're not being too formulaic again. So we always talk about, we don't want to start with a briefing scene every week because we're bored, so someone else will be bored. Yeah. And Sally's just delivered half of a script, at the beginning of a script, which literally starts with the game Monopoly, which is just so brilliant because the crime comes knocking at the door instead of it being you start in the police station. I just think you've got to find different ways to introduce it to keep it engaging.
Do you like Monopoly?
Is it me that's doing it?
No.
Doesn't matter.
We've got time for one more question. Gentleman over there.
Hi, my name is Svein Tore, and I'm from TV Norway, head of communication. This is probably a big question as the last question, but you talked about Mad Men, and Mad Men is an example of quality TV drama, but in Norway and I guess other countries, niche. It's like very few people who watch Mad Men in Norway. What differs the quality TV drama as Mad Men and the examples we have here from the really broad TV drama? Because Mad Men is few viewers in Norway. We have some TV drama that's 1 million viewers in Norway with 5 million people, so that's quite a lot. And then a Mad Men is like 10,000. So what kind of differs the broad from the niche? Obviously not quality.
So what's the difference between a broad, what will get you a broad audience?
It's really hard to tell because why people watch things and why they don't, but Mad Men specifically, but I mean I kind of resent that because, not resent it, but things that have 8 million viewers or 6 million viewers or 5 million viewers are not quality, they're just watched quality. For me, why Mad Men isn't more attractive, and we can all say it's beautiful and brilliant and isn't it filmic and all that, is not enough happens. Really, basically, I don't think there's enough. Enough happens to those characters along the years to make you constantly need to switch on. You might love the atmosphere of the 60s, or he's very attractive, or it's great, it's powerful, but it doesn't like rip your heart out every week. And what we try and do is make sure that there's always something changing every week, so that you have to watch.
Yes, I think that's a really good point. And I think one of the things is that with I am a Mad Men fan. It does have a niche audience over here as well, and it's actually quite difficult to find. I think that's one thing we have to address. You know, it's moved around and it's now available on a subscription-only channel, and it does punch above its weight in terms of the number of fans it has within the business or within the press. Just as I think Homeland has a relatively small audience compared to Scott and Bailey and Call the Midwife, but you can't deny that it's a huge hit. It's hugely appreciated and very much affecting people's thinking in the industry now. And I just think, you know, it's a different genre, certainly to stuff that I've been working on. It doesn't mean I don't learn some lessons from it that I then try to incorporate into shows which are much more popular and accessible, I think is probably the word. And I use the word accessible as an absolute good. I think, you know, I'm very proud to have created accessible television. It doesn't mean I don't enjoy stuff which is a bit more obscure and learn from it, because I think it's very arrogant to think you can't learn from other genres.
I think the idea of...
sorry, just so about why I love Mad Men is because not a lot happens, and because it's about the characters, which I kind of buy into. And I guess what I was saying before about why I was sat here thinking, God, in our ITV hour, which is
46 minutes.
46 minutes, you've got Janet and Rachel as friends, then you've got Rachel in her own life, then you've got Janet in her own life. Jill, you don't really kind of go back into her life. And then you've got the crime, and we've split over a couple of episodes, haven't we? But mainly in the first two series, the crimes were contained. So there's an awful lot going on. And the impact of the story is the thing that kind of makes you then tune in, you know, the story of the week. But actually what I love is that we're a real mix of Rachel and Janet doing their kind of home things, separate things, and then there's a story of the week, which keeps you hooked. So maybe that's why I like Scott and Bailey.
Well, I'm looking forward now to Sister Evangelina being turned by Al-Qaeda in the next series.
Time, Neil.
It is, we just need to get up to date. Look, we have run out of time. I'm very sorry about my voice. My panel have been Sally Wainwright, Saran Jones, Nicola Schindler, Heidi Thomas, Pippa Harris and James Murphy. Please join me in thanking them.